So I'm aware of the fact that the title of this channel is Mike Reads, and the subject of this review is not going to be a book, but we've done reviews before that weren't books, and I think the subject matter is going to interest the viewers of this channel, and that subject, of course, is the movie Run, Hide, Fight, which is the Daily Wire's first entry into the field of cinematic movie making. So I'd love to talk about what it is, because that's how I usually introduce my reviews, but first I have to take care of some housekeeping, and that piece of housekeeping I need to take care of is normally you'd find a link in my reviews descriptions as to where you could find the thing I'm reviewing. Today you won't see that, and that's because I don't know where to send you guys. It seems that the only place that you're going to be able to find this movie is the Daily Wire, and there's kind of a giant paywall in order to be able to see the movie. I wound up eating the paywall by paying $14 for a single month of subscription to the Daily Wire so I could see the movie, and the way I was able to, in my mind, justify that was, well, the written reviews I'm seeing online are fairly positive, and this is how, 20 years ago we would have done things when it comes to going to a movie theater. So to me, $14 was very close to the price of a ticket at the movie theater, in my area anyways. So I paid the price and said to myself, I'm going to the movies, and this is how I'm going to treat this. And if you choose to treat it that way, that's your choice. That's the way I chose to treat it. But again, because this is not going to get a mainstream distribution, because this is not going to get a widespread distribution, because it's not likely to ever go into syndication, I don't know what to tell you folks. And I'm not keen on sending people to a place where you're going to have to get through a giant paywall to see the thing that I'm reviewing. So again, I don't know where to send you guys. I don't know what to do about that. So let's just move on to what the actual movie is. And the movie is something I would describe as an action thriller, not a straight action movie, about a school shooting that people have described as Die Hard. And it's true. It's Die Hard. Somebody jokingly called the movie Die Hard School Days. That is an honest-to-God, perfectly accurate description, as reductionist as it is, of what the movie actually is. And for a lot of the people at home, I have a feeling, based on the IMDb reviews of Die Hard, that's really not an insult to the movie, because the movie actually does a pretty good job of presenting itself, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But it really is just straight Die Hard, like right down to the shooters are terrorists, the protagonist is John McClane, the walkie-talkie conversations with the antagonist, the cheesy cop outside B or C stories. It's Die Hard. It's Die Hard School Days. And that's not a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing, but it's not a bad thing, and we'll get into that in more detail in just a minute, because my overall review is that the movie's actually legitimate. It's very well done. I'd call it solid. It's not Shawshank, guys. It's not The Godfather, guys. It's Die Hard, which is a really good movie, but also not without its flaws. My overall take in relating it to Die Hard is that it's definitely darker than Die Hard, which doesn't necessarily mean better, because I'm not a subscriber to the notion that darker means better, but it is definitely darker than Die Hard, and there are some psychological elements to the movie that make it an action thriller as opposed to Die Hard, which is just a straight action movie. I will say that, yes, the first act was very weak. And it was the weakest part of the movie by far. The first 10 minutes are going to be kind of a little bit of cringe that you're gonna have to just fight your way through. And honestly, the last 5 minutes or so, the tail end of the movie wasn't really well done, and it kind of ruined my suspension of disbelief a little bit in those last 5 minutes. However, the whole movie is saved and fully redeemed by the second act, which was really well done. I mean, the second act is like Fight Club level good. So if you're going to go see it, I'm going to tell people in advance, warn people in advance, yes, those first 10 minutes are going to be a little bad, but you're going to have to tolerate them to get through the middle hour of the movie, which is really well done. And the reason it's really well done is because we have a story here of basically just protagonist versus antagonist, which is a pretty basic way of just building a framework towards a good story. You don't need to have a protagonist versus antagonist story. You don't need a clear protagonist. You don't need a clear antagonist. But it's an easy way to build, from a structural and framework standpoint, a story that is actually a good and decent story. And in this case, we have a clear protagonist, a clear antagonist, and this story is really well done. For those who are wondering about the politics coming in, the movie is, there's very little social commentary. The movie is not political, and I would at least say that it's not political to the point in the sense that it's definitely not something you would know was produced by the Daily Wire if you didn't already know it was produced by the Daily Wire. The biggest plus of the movie, as we get into a bit more specific here, was the antagonist. So the antagonist in this case, very well acted. In fact, I think the best performance in terms of acting in the entire movie. Great character development. The antagonist was actually believable and relatable, which this movie needs. You didn't need Darth Vader to be believable and necessarily relatable in Star Wars, but in the case of this movie, for what it's presenting, which is a school shooting, and no, it's not a spoiler to say that it's presenting the stories about a school shooting. This version of this story needed the antagonist to be believable and to a certain degree, at least somewhat relatable in terms of their character motivations, at least. This was actually really, really well done. And in this case, the antagonist in Die Hard School Days and Run, Hide, Fight was better than the antagonist in Die Hard, and obviously so in my opinion. This is easily the highlight of the movie. This is the antagonist in this movie. And in short, he's Joker. I would say that in this case, it's Joker minus the face paint. When I say Joker, I don't mean the Joker. I mean Joker. Because he's probably a mix of the Joker from Dark Knight and Joker from Joker, but it's more like 80% Joker, 20% the Joker. I have in my notes here that it's 75-25. Splitting a hair on that difference. But yeah, you take Joker, put him in high school, remove the makeup, and there's your antagonist. And the biggest weakness, I would say, from the movie was the acting overall. The characters were a little bit above age, but not by that much, but they did look like they were 30-year-olds portraying teenagers. I would say the weakest performance in general, and this is kind of a real detractor to the movie and a real distraction from the movie, was from the lead. And in this case, there's the protagonist. She's supposed to be an 18-year-old who's in the school and who's basically playing the John McClane character in this case. She does really well when she gets through the first act, but that first 10 minutes is kind of really weak. And although she does really well once you get through that first act, her performance overall is definitely the weakness of the film in terms of acting. Now, that said, I don't consider acting to be the major determinant of the quality of a movie. But in this case, it was a little bit of a distraction. I did like the side characters, though the love interest in this case seems forced, and the character who played the love interest, in my opinion, gave the second worst performance. I've talked a lot about that first act being kind of a detractor to the movie. So the movie starts off in the morning of the shooting, so there's a bit of setup, just generic character introduction, and this is easily the worst part of the movie. It's kind of, the character introductions are kind of derivative, and it relies a little bit too much on cliche, and there's a little bit too much of, I won't try to reveal too much here, but Chekhov's gun in the beginning, and it's kind of predictable in that first act, that these Chekhov's guns are just that, and it's not foreshadowing in a way that I would prefer. There are some elements of the movie that has some excellent use of foreshadowing in the way that it's cinematically presented. So where you have the characters are in the foreground, but the foreground is dark, and in the background you have a very well lit and still somewhat in focus background to kind of clue you into the fact that what's in the background is something that you're going to have your mind in some way set on at some point. That said, this is instantly made up for in the second act, and there's a clear transition, which I won't spoil, but there's a clear transition from first act to the second act, and it's handled extremely well. And I don't really have much more to say about the second act, without spoiling it, other than that it's really, really, really well done. Honest to God, really well done. There are some flags I'll have to point out, that is that this movie is very violent. The violence is handled extremely well, but it's also incredibly violent, and the movie definitely earned its R rating. In this case, the violence is not forced. In some ways, in the movie Die Hard, the violence seemed somewhat forced. It clearly has a purpose and fits into the film's context and events. And the violence is, how would I describe it? It's without setup, and it seems more real this way. So the violence is something that I would it's kind of a lot like how you would, if you guys have seen the videos of the Columbine shootings, the violence is utterly remorseless, and the way that the violence is portrayed in the movie is just that, utterly remorseless. And I don't know that you would necessarily want violence to be always treated with a completely remorseless touch and presentation, but in this case, we're dealing with a school shooting. And we're dealing with the psychological aspects of the school shooting. So we need these we need the violence to be remorseless. And there is some gore. And I think that the level of gore is on the high side. It's maybe not all the way to Quentin Tarantino, but we're like right on the doorstep of Quentin Tarantino in terms of gore. But we kind of need it in this movie because part of the movie is part of what works in the movie is the psychological element of the movie. And in order for us to get into the minds of the characters in the movie, we need to see the things that they see. We need to know why it is that they are acting the way that they're acting, and that they're responding to the violence that they're responding to. If we just see, the old 70s grabs his chest and kind of collapses to the ground with no blood, then we're missing an element of what makes these events so terrifying, which is seeing the gore. When you get a bunch of teenagers that are seeing blood explode out of somebody's chest and having them just instantly drop to the ground and with no setup, it's just bullet, brain, dead. And I really hope I haven't spoiled anything in saying that, but it is really violent, and you probably should you should definitely be putting the kids to bed before you watch this movie. So I'll wrap it up with just kind of a bit of an overall, and I like to use this overall moment to give my rating on a scale of 1 to 10, as I always like to close my reviews with. I'll like I said, I'm going to wrap this up with the overall. The movie is saved by its second half, and yes, as I mentioned, as I'm reviewing my notes here, it is much darker than Die Hard, and somewhat more forced in certain places overall, but it's at least as good as Die Hard. And when I looked at my review of Die Hard on IMDb, I gave Die Hard a 7 out of 10. I think that's probably where I would put Run, Hide, Fight, is a 7 out of 10. It's a very, very confident 7 or a very weak 8, somewhere in there. And it may actually be, in my opinion, upon further reviewing, if I actually go back and rewatch this may wind up being better, in my opinion, than Die Hard, because there's a lot less cheese and schlock than what we've seen in Die Hard. Die Hard had quite a bit of cheese, especially the hanging from the cliff hanging scene at the very end of the movie. There were some explosions that were just so forced, and were so just like 10 angles of the same explosion because boom, explosion. And I think that was a detractor for me for Die Hard. And there's a whole lot less of that in this movie. It's not to say there isn't any, but there's a whole lot less. And the last thing I'll say about this is that you guys have seen my reviews. I actually did review one of Ben Shapiro's works, and the review was highly critical. And if you guys have followed my other channel at all, you'll know that I've been highly critical of Ben's taste in movies. So this is not me coming in from a biased perspective or some Shapiro fanboy perspective. And I want to let people know that this isn't a biased take. So when you guys see the reviews on places like Metacritic, on places like Rotten Tomatoes that are coming from the fans and not from the critics, know that this is real, that this movie really is really well done. It's flawed. It's not Shawshank. It's not The Godfather. It's Die Hard. And if that's something you guys are interested in, I do recommend checking it out. So that's been my review of Run, Hide, Fight. Hope you guys have enjoyed or at least found it useful, and we'll see you in the next one. Night, folks.